Hello and welcome to the Love History Podcast, episode 4. Wonderful to see you here today, Louisa. How are you?
Hello, I'm good, thank you. How are you?
Very well. I am excited for our guest today because our guest is your guest. I know we're going to get on and hear from her in a moment, but tell us a little bit about who you have been chatting to.
Karolina Zabrowska. I know that's not the correct pronunciation of her surname. She's a Polish lady who lives in Poland, and she knows everything historical, but I know her through costuming. And so she's going to talk to us a little bit about historical fashion. And hopefully we'll all learn something new.
Yeah, I'm absolutely fascinated to hear from her and also quite excited to hand over this podcast episode to you. And talking about you, what have you been up to, historically speaking? What have you been up to?
Historically speaking, well, for those who follow me on Instagram, Louisa's Got Sewing, I went to a party last Friday at Apsley House, which is also known as Number One London, which is also known as Duke of Wellington's house on Hyde Park Corner. And I went to a sort of evening soiree where we learnt to dance, play cards, cut silhouettes, and a little bit of Regency etiquette. And get this, Mock, I dressed as a Regency dandy. And I had a bicorn hat. I looked very, very dapper.
Now, I have to say, I saw you, because obviously I follow you on Louisa Scott Sewing. I saw your gender fluidity. I loved it. A bit of what gender am I? And you looked terribly smart in those breeches. And then I believe you ended up being all fancy at Claridge's at the end of the night. Is that right?
Oh, that's true. Yes, we did. Well, the evening ended too early. So we thought, let's go for a very expensive cocktail. No, it was at the Lanesborough.
Lanesborough.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Beg your pardon.
Yes. And
Just
what about you,
correct.
Mock? What have you been up to in your baby castle?
Oh, yes. So for those of you who don't know, I am Mock O'Keefe. You can find me on the socials at Mock O'Keefe, 2 E's, 2 F's and 1 E, and also in the show notes too. And I live in a little Elizabethan castle in Wales. And Elizabethan castles can be damp and wet. And the turret leaked last year. We've been having it repaired. And this week they were about to start the plastering. So for 7 days, I had a dehumidifier going in the bedroom of the turret, which was sucking out all the moisture from the walls, lovely historical walls. And I've been emptying hundreds of buckets of water and throwing them out the turret window onto the garden, making sure the walls are absolutely dry. So anyone who ever gets to stay here and it gets launched as an Airbnb next year will see this beautiful dog rose pink bedroom with a 4-poster bed and gorgeous silk cushions. They won't see in its current state with bits of plaster and wet walls, although it's looking a lot better than it was. But listen, enough of us talking. If anyone wants to ask us any questions before we ask Karolina any questions, they can email us on lovehistorypodcast@gmail.com. But I think we should go straight over to your interview with Karolina because it's absolutely fascinating. So on with the show.
Hi, everybody, and welcome this week. We've got Karolina. Hi, Karolina. Hi, Mock.
Hi.
We are so thrilled that you're here to talk to us all about historical fashion. But before we start, I just wanted to say, when you and I go around together, people pop up to you and they say, oh, aren't you the lady off YouTube? For those few people in the world who haven't come across you, very quickly, just tell us what you do on your YouTube channel, and then we'll get on to the historical stuff.
So I mainly love exploring all sorts of history. I love women's history. I love where history and sort of modern silly stuff intertwines. So all sorts of like sketches, modern versions of something historical. I love that. Fashion history, of course. So all sorts of like what people wore, why people wore that, where did it come from, how popular it was, where it was popular, or something that people are obsessed with because people are mean. People love when I criticize how costumes are made in period dramas. So a lot of that too. I will just review period dramas and say, this is not quite accurate. This is actually really nice. So yeah, this is sort of like a selection of what I do on my channel.
Karolina, you are very famous in critiquing costumes for movies. can you tell us what we should be looking out for in an accurate costume historical drama?
Several things that I always notice. Like a really good giveaway that the costume designers have put a lot of thought into the costumes is not actually costumes, it's hair and headdresses. So I think if there is historical hair and historical headdresses, there's a pretty good chance that the costumes are also accurate, because it would be pretty unusual to go for accurate hairstyles and historical headdresses, but not the clothes. So usually if I see, let's say, screen grabs from a movie and it's just a portrait shot of a person, I'm like, yeah, this is gonna be good, because you can tell by the hair and by the bonnets and by the elaborate, whatever decoration is going on, that the rest of the outfit is probably also gonna be good. So this is like one thing that I look at. And the second thing is structure. So if there is some sort of corseting, boning, structural undergarments going on, then there is also a good chance that they have researched what was going on underneath the dress. So it usually also means that the dress is also going to be at least like highly inspired by history, let's say.
Do you think there's any room for historical fantasy in films? There's one particular TV show I'm thinking of, but you elaborate.
I really like when people don't necessarily follow the strictly historical route in costuming, but I like it the most when they know what they're doing and when they research the era beforehand, because then they know what they can play with. So, for example, in The Favourite, they stuck to the historical structure and silhouette of a mantua dress, but they used like modern plastic, PVC, leather, fabrics, jeans, all that stuff. So this is what I appreciate the most, because to me it looks good, but it's also not boring, because if we were only to see 100% recreations of original gowns, we'd probably be a little bored. But this is more inventive to me. So I love when people use historical silhouettes, use historical trends, but then they put their own twist on it. Like also Anna Karenina, is it the 2012 movie? There is also a lot of sort of twisting in that area of costuming, where it's kind of 1870s, but it's also very 1950s Dior. And yeah, these are my favorite types of like historical fantasy and costumes, I would say.
So we've been to a few costume things together. Is there anything that you have made and you have worn that was really, really challenging to make and wear?
I think you know the answers to that.
I want our listeners to hear all about this.
Yeah, definitely the massive Regency era Georgian court gown. Because it was just so complex, there were so many layers, and it was just a little difficult to like go around it. But in terms of making it, it wasn't actually too complex. I was actually surprised at how simple it was to make. The most difficult part was to get it right and to get it looking like the fashion plate. But the actual construction was probably a little simpler than the regular Regency dress, which was surprising. Minus like the obnoxious amount of trimming. That's probably a little unusual. But in terms of walking around in it, that was probably a little bit of a challenge, especially like in a ballroom situation when you're trying to like twirl and look graceful, but you're also having this like 10-yard train behind you, and a massive hoop.
So do you think fashion plates are the best place to look for research for wearing something ridiculous?
They're a pretty good starting point. I usually like to have a couple of sources to compare things, because fashion plates are a very like idealistic picture of what fashion looked like, but then you compare it with portraits or photos sometimes in the later ones, and you're like, it didn't look like that actually at all. So I like to do a little bit of everything. I like to look at portraits, at photographs. Sometimes it's good when it's the later eras and it's the movies, because then you can see what it actually looked like in movement, and from the side, from the back, it gives you a much more clearer perspective of what it actually looked like than just seeing like a picture. But fashion plates are probably the most fun because they did a lot of things that were not necessarily possible in real life. So they sometimes just look more funny than the actual real deal.
But speaking of some ridiculous outfits and things, so I love fashion history. I love the elegance of the Edwardians and the opulence of the 18th century. But there are some pretty bizarre and silly things too. I'm thinking of the 1830s hairdos that come up like this, or even the Spanish farthingales of the Elizabethan times. They're just ridiculous things to wear. Have you come across anything that you find just really ridiculous, but so fun, I must just wear something really ridiculous?
So many things. Like every time I'm doing a deep dive in a historical era, I'm always like, no, this is too much. Especially since some of the trends started in a really calm way, but then they started growing and growing and growing. So, for example, I'm doing a deep dive right now into 15th century headwear, and it started off like as those simple horn-shaped hairstyles. But then they started growing, and then they were like, we actually can't do this with our hair only because we don't have enough hair. So then they started implementing all these headpieces and caps and wired veils, and they started growing, and they turned into those massive horns, and then they turned into those really long pipe-like structures. So yeah, yeah, definitely weird. And it's funny to me because a lot of people at the time were criticizing the trend and saying that, obviously it looks like horns, so it looks like the devil a little bit. But at the same time, you can tell that the rich and influential ladies really did not care. And in the paintings, like the richest of the ladies would have the highest, the tallest headwear possible because it was the most fashionable. So but yeah, in every era there is so much of this stuff where you just go like, why did they wear it? Like, was there not one person that would go like, no, this is kind of stupid, actually, we should stop?
It reminds me of the sketch in Blackadder when he's got a massive ruff. And I heard that they got so big that they couldn't actually feed themselves. Is this true?
They got pretty big at some point. I'm not sure if like the really big ones were used for eating. They might have been like ceremonial ones, but the ones I've seen in some paintings, they definitely are satellite dish size.
So I have got a bugbear, which I know is your bugbear as well, as of several costumiers I know, and is the corset. Is the corset really that uncomfortable? Is the corset really a torture device? Is the corset really detrimental to your health and you had to have ribs removed, etc., etc.?
I'm just curious why we are still so excited about the corset and why it's so controversial. If I think that corset still exists nowadays in like evening wear and shapewear, and no one's saying anything, but suddenly when it's the 19th century, everyone's like, no, it was unhealthy. They overdid it. We overdo everything. Like everything, if you're not cautious about it, it's probably going to be bad for you, like overeating or not eating enough. But with corsetry, it's I'm not sure why it's such a controversial topic still, especially since we survived so many centuries wearing it, and obviously we're still here, so it probably wasn't that bad.
Do you find them more comfortable?
I do not find them uncomfortable. And actually, I think it's getting used to it. That is the process that you need to go through in order for it to be comfortable. Because at the beginning of the day, when you just woke up, you probably know, like when you're at a historical event, that's the last thing you want to do. Like you just had a breakfast and you're like, oh gosh, no, here we go again. But some women feel this way about wearing bras also. So I would say anything that is a little tight or uncomfortable can be annoying. But then as the day goes on, I feel gradually more and more comfortable. And by the end of the day, I actually feel a little sad about taking it off. Like I'm so used to it at that point, to the little like to the way it makes my posture straighten up a little, to the way it carries my skirts around, to the way my hips sway, that I'm a little sad when I have to like get back to my regular, normal, boring clothes.
You know, I have an Irish grandmother, and she sadly no longer with us, but she died about I don't know 45 years ago. But she wore a corset all her life. I mean, she was rural Ireland, born in the 1800s probably. If my father was born in 1920, but she was a farmer's wife who wore a corset. So she milked cows. She went out in the field. She carried pails of water. She had 11 children wearing a corset. They have to be more practical, I think, than they're given credit for, or certainly Granny wouldn't have worn one.
Yeah, I definitely agree. That's really interesting because, yeah, that's something that we also forget about. A lot of working class women also wore them. So it wasn't just like a fashion fad, it was actually supportive garment. So yeah, that's a good story in terms of how it could actually be supportive. And I'm assuming someone who had that many children, it was also good to like keep your stomach and all of the intestines and all of that stuff in check as you had this structure that was supporting you a little
Yeah.
bit. Yeah.
Absolutely. Although Irish Catholics, I don't think she was unusual in having that many children in the early 20th century.
Yeah, that was probably the average.
Karolina, I just wanted to get your opinion on modern fashion. I know we're a history channel, but I'm just comparing today's fast fashion with slow fashion of the past. And if you think how long it took to create a garment and how much value people would put in what they wore, and they would reuse, recut, all that kind of stuff. And nowadays, everybody wants to go out and buy their £1.50 t-shirt. I'm trying to help people to reuse and recut something from a few decades ago that's not fashionable anymore. How do you think we can solve this hideous fast fashion and get everybody dressing in the past?
Yeah. Yeah, it is really hard. I think at the core of it, people will have to change their mindsets to, first of all, realize that clothes are perfectly fine if you mend them. You don't have to throw something away just because it's faded or a little torn or the seam has busted. That's one thing that I have learned personally, because I would just be like, okay, that's off now. And it does take time, so it's not easy if you're, working hard and you don't have a lot of free time. Like the last thing you want to do is probably mend, but that's one thing to go about it. The other thing is, how much clothes do we actually need? And it's again something that I'm struggling with myself, because even when I'm buying vintage fashions, I'm always like, well, this is so pretty though, and if I don't buy it now, I will never see it again. But at the same time, my wardrobe is completely full. I have like 10 skirts. I absolutely don't need any more. And yeah, it's maybe this mindset that people back then had of, as long as you have, clothes, you're fine. They don't have to be ugly. You can have a couple of very pretty ones, but maybe just this modesty of having less pieces in your wardrobe and just rotating. Yeah, this is something I'm trying to teach myself as well.
Also, I think vintage pieces were made better than they are now. So having a wardrobe with a few vintage pieces, I think, makes you very stylish.
Yeah, that's true. They were very like, especially heavier things. I feel like jackets and coats. They were just finished in a much better way. So they do last. They seem to last forever. Like even if you bust a seam here and there, you just like mend it and you can continue wearing them. And they have survived 80, 90 years. So yeah, I'm not sure if modern pieces could do that.
Well, it's true.
Karolina, I've got some questions for you. We always do this. It's a little bit of a quick fire. So we want your first responses, not too much thinking about it, if that's okay. So,
Oh gosh.
18th century or 20th century?
Oh my god. Let's say 20th.
20th, okay. Dining room or picnic?
Oh. Picnic.
Modern or vintage?
Vintage.
Beauty videos or fashion videos?
Fashion videos.
I love your beauty videos, by the way, though. Even though I don't use beauty products, I love them. And finally, Instagram or YouTube?
YouTube.
YouTube. And if people want to find you on YouTube, where will they find you? What should they look at on YouTube? What do they need to type in?
Probably my name, Karolina Zabrowska, for the English speaking out there, because that's not actually how you actually pronounce my name, but that's the way people will get it. And yeah, that should do it. Or anything. If you write something crazy like Edwardian lady behaving inappropriately, that's probably gonna be me as well. So in case you don't get the name, just try coming up with a crazy mashup of modern and historical, and it's probably gonna come up.
Well, I'll make sure that when this goes up, all of our viewers on YouTube and our listeners on any of the platforms, it's in the show notes. And there's a click through there. We'll put all your links to Instagram, YouTube, all the social platforms, and make sure it's on there. So thanks very much. And Louisa, back to you.
Thank you, Karolina, so much for chatting to us. I could talk to you all day. I still have so many more questions. But I just wanted to say that if anybody has a question for you, or indeed us, they can email us on lovehistorypodcast@gmail.com.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Oh, well, that was fascinating.
Did you enjoy that?
I did. I enjoyed being relatively quiet for once and listening to you ask the questions, which is absolutely brilliant, and well done. That was lovely.
What did you learn? What did you not know that she told us?
Oh gosh, so what did I learn? I think for me, I thought that she was going to be a real purist because, she's a historian. She's really into the research. I thought she'd be a real purist around about historical movies, historical films. I thought she'd be like, criticizing this project and this one here, where actually I was really encouraged, and I think it leaves continuing room for creativity, that she said, actually, it was okay in The Favourite to have PVC or leather. If they are almost acknowledging that they're playing around with the style of the time and using fabrics that might not have been available, or Bridgerton, where they have, colors and they have individuals who wouldn't have been in those roles, characters and colors that may not have existed, or fabrics that didn't exist at the time. But it's part of the fantasy. I was really glad that she didn't criticize that, because I think for costume designers, it allows them to continue to be inventive and creative rather than just slavishly copying what a coat looked like in 1790 and reproducing it in 2024. I loved that. How about you? Now, you obviously know a lot about this stuff, but is there something, I'm sure she was so learned, is there something that you learned or got reinforced when you were listening to Karolina?
Well, it was when she was talking about the hairstyles. So we all do a little hairstyle, and then clearly the fashion was getting bigger and bigger and bigger until they had to use fake hair and structures underneath. And I particularly love the horns. I mean, just how ridiculous can that be? Just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And it reminds me of even fashions today. Things just go to the extremes. People just wear the silliest things, and the makeup is just enormous. And you just wonder, we sort of go like this, I think, with let's go really, really big, let's go really, really minimal. And it was just quite fun to hear that they also did this in history. I know in the Victorian times, hair got bigger and bigger and bigger. And in the 18th century with the Duchess, the hair got bigger and bigger and bigger. It's so fun, isn't it? To just hear about these different extremes. And there's always something that you hadn't come across before. And you think, really? They were doing that then? Yeah. So that I found really fun.
We possibly think people in the past are conservative, but they're just as crazy, just as extreme, and often just as bold and or vulnerable as we are. They're just humans, and they're trying out new hairstyles, and they're all saying, look at me, or in our case, listen to our podcast. And talking of look at me, if people want to find you, just remind us again, your Instagram and YouTube handles are?
For me, Louisa Scott Sewing, because I make historical clothes. And for you, Mock?
So I am on Instagram as @Mock O'Keefe, and I'm on TikTok @Mock O'Keefe1. And if you want to send a message to either Louisa and I, asking us a question, suggesting a guest, or giving us feedback on the show, you can send us an email on lovehistorypodcast@gmail.com. Please do leave a review. Leave a comment if you're watching this on YouTube, and maybe even share this podcast with someone else. It really helps if we get as many listeners as possible so Louisa and I can carry on making this show. So next week we have one more exciting guest, which is, I'm not going to give away the name, but this is all about creating your own history and reinventing your history. It's another author, and we look forward to seeing you next Thursday for Love History Podcast, episode 5 and the end of series 2. So, Louisa, I wish you a fabulous week. Take care.
Thank you, Mark.
All of our listeners and our viewers, wherever you are and whoever you love, we wish you well and we wish you joy. Take care. See you soon.